Okay, let's dive right into this. When we think of the RMS Titanic, the images that usually spring to mind are opulent ballrooms, tragic romance, and this unavoidable active nature. But in this explainer, we're going to look at this event through a completely different lens. We are stripping away the Hollywood glamour to look at the cold, hard facts. Because what happened on the night of April 14th, 1912, wasn't just a tragic accident, it was a devastating forensic failure. We're going to analyze exactly how corporate pressure, systemic negligence, and a culture of sheer human hubris combined to cause one of the most preventable maritime disasters in human history. To really unpack how this happened, we've structured this explainer into 5 parts: the unsinkable illusion, prioritizing speed over safety, anatomy of a collision, systemic rescue failures, and finally, the legacy of the Titanic. Section 1. The unsinkable illusion and a foundation of hubris. The Titanic was an absolute marvel of its time. I mean, we were talking an astonishing 269 meters long, fully equipped with stained glass mirrors, a heated swimming pool, a Turkish bath, and even a full squash court. It cost $7.5 million to build back then, which, to put that into perspective, is roughly $400 million today. But here's the thing. This unprecedented luxury masked a catastrophic arrogance that would literally doom the passengers before the ship even left the port of Southampton. This hubris was perfectly captured by the vice president of the White Star Line, who proudly declared to the public, "This ship is unsinkable." You know, this wasn't just a catchy marketing slogan, it was a deeply held, fatal belief woven right into the very fabric of the company's culture. And as we're going to see, when leadership genuinely believes their creation is immune to failure, safety protocols just become an afterthought. And this brilliantly illustrates the horrific cost of that corporate hubris when we look at the sheer math of the situation. You have roughly 2,200 passengers and crew on board, but the total capacity for all 20 lifeboats combined was only around 1,200 people. Why? Because the White Star Line genuinely believed lifeboats were unnecessary. They thought they were building a ship that could never, ever sink, so they prioritized deck space and aesthetics over life-saving equipment. They set out with the mathematical certainty that if things went wrong, 1,000 people would literally have no way off. Section 2. Prioritizing speed over safety. The chain of negligence. The hardest truth to swallow is that this tragedy was entirely preventable. The Atlantic Ocean was littered with icebergs at the time, and standard procedure was for ships to radio warnings to each other. The Titanic received plenty of them, yet they sailed directly into danger. Let's actually trace the timeline of April 14th. By the morning, ice warnings are already pouring in. The Titanic even alters its course twice, but crucially, it does not slow down. Then, the most shocking systemic failure happens right at 2 p.m. Captain Edward Smith receives an ice warning and shows it to Joseph Bruce Ismay, the managing director of White Star Line. Instead of demanding caution, Ismay takes the paper and literally stuffs it into his pocket so the other crew members won't see it. As evening falls, 7 total warnings are completely ignored, and the ship barrels into the pitch-black night at 21.5 knots, which is about 40 kilometers per hour. So you have to ask yourself, why would leadership actively hide a safety warning? 2 words: corporate pressure. The White Star Line didn't just want the Titanic to be the biggest and most luxurious ship, they wanted it to be the fastest. They were desperate to complete the maiden voyage in just 6 days to set a brand new speed record. This toxic corporate culture prioritized headlines and records over human life, actively pushing the 62-year-old Captain Smith to maintain full speed straight into a known dangerous ice field. Section 3. Anatomy of a collision. The 11:39 p.m. breakdown. Let's move to and see how this builds into the frantic final minute. At 11:39 p.m., the temperature has absolutely plummeted, and with zero moonlight, visibility is terrifyingly low. Sitting way up in the freezing crow's nest, Frederick Fleet suddenly spots a massive iceberg right in front of them. He frantically rings the bell 3 times and calls the bridge. First Officer William immediately signals the engine room and orders the ship to be steered to the left. But down at the wheel, steersman Robert Hitchens panics. In the utter chaos of the moment, he completely misunderstands the instruction and steers the ship to the right, turning them directly toward the iceberg. By the time he realizes his catastrophic mistake, it is simply too late. And here is exactly where the so-called unsinkable engineering completely failed them. The ship's hull relied on 2 main safety features: a double bottom and 16 separate watertight compartments. The engineers had calculated that even if 4 of these compartments flooded, the ship would stay afloat. But because steersman Hitchens steered into the ice, the ship grazed its side, rendering that reinforced double bottom entirely useless. The side impact breached not 4, but 6 watertight compartments. Mathematically, in that exact split second, the ship was now guaranteed to sink. It's really hard to fully fathom the physics of this crash. I mean, how does ice just cut right through solid metal? Well, this wasn't an ice cube. This iceberg was the size of a professional football field, 200 by 400 feet, towering as high as the ship's own crow's nest. Scientists estimate it weighed a staggering 1.5 million tons. So when the Titanic grazed this colossal mountain of ice for just 10 seconds along its right side bow, the sheer weight and force of those 1.5 million tons easily tore massive dents and holes right through the single-layered metal siding. Section 4. Systemic Rescue Failures. A catastrophic communication breakdown. The collision was a mix of mechanical limits and human error. But what followed was a catastrophic breakdown in communication that permanently sealed the fate of over 1,500 people. 20 minutes after the crash, at midnight, Captain Smith finally orders distress calls to be sent out. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this single number, 37 kilometers. That was the distance between the sinking Titanic and another ship, the SS Californian. The Californian was so incredibly close that Titanic officers could literally see its lights on the horizon. An officer even told panicked passengers not to worry because a ship was clearly visible and would come to save them. It could have easily arrived in time to save every single person on board. But let's contrast the two ships that were actually in the area. The RMS Carpathia picked up the desperate SOS signals sent by Titanic's hero radio operator Jack Phillips. But the Carpathia was 107 kilometers away. That's a 3.5-hour journey. Then you have the SS Californian, sitting just 37 kilometers away. So why didn't they come? Because at 11:15 p.m., the radio operator simply switched off the radio and went to sleep. When the Titanic fired emergency distress rockets high into the night sky, the crew of the Californian absolutely saw them. They informed Captain Stanley Lord, but he incredibly dismissed the flares, assuming the rich people on the Titanic were merely throwing a lavish late-night party. And while no help was coming, the evacuation on board the Titanic was just pure chaos. Captain Smith had literally canceled a scheduled safety drill that very morning because he thought it was, you guessed it, unnecessary. As a result, the crew had absolutely no idea how to efficiently load the boats. Worse still, the unsinkable propaganda worked far too well. Passengers simply didn't believe they were in any real danger. Because of this complete lack of urgency, the very first lifeboat, which had 65 seats, was lowered into the freezing ocean with only 28 people inside. More than half the seats were left completely empty, while 1,500 people remained stranded on a rapidly sinking ship. Finally, Section 5, the legacy of Titanic, aftermath and hubris. By 2:20 a.m., less than 3 hours after hitting the iceberg, the ship broke in two and sank, claiming over 1,500 lives. Tragically, many perished from hypothermia in the -2°C water. So the crucial point is that modern maritime safety was literally written in their blood. Out of this incredibly preventable disaster, the International Ice Patrol was formed in 1914 to actively alert ships of icebergs in their path. And even more importantly, the SOLAS Treaty, the Safety of Life at Sea Convention, was signed, permanently mandating that every single passenger ship must carry a sufficient number of lifeboats for every single soul on board. No more mathematical compromises for the sake of luxury. You know, it took over 70 years to finally locate the wreckage. In 1985, explorers found the remains of the ship split in two, sitting a crushing 3,800 meters deep on the ocean floor. But the physical ship is actually vanishing as we speak. Bacteria and underwater organisms are actively eating away at the metal framework. And scientists estimate that by the year 2030, the wreckage of the Titanic will completely disintegrate into the ocean, essentially disappearing forever. Yet, over a century later, the world remains completely obsessed with this tragedy. In fact, an exact replica, the Titanic II, has been in the works for years, though it suffers from heavy delays, reportedly because modern passengers just aren't interested in a ship without Wi-Fi and TVs. Which leaves us with a final, fascinating thought to ponder. As we look at the legacy of this disaster, is our enduring fascination really about the romance and the luxury of the ship? Or is it a haunting, permanent reminder of the true cost of human hubris, of exactly what happens when corporate egos prioritize speed, ignore the obvious warnings right in front of them, and gamble with human life? Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the systems around you, and I'll catch you in the next one.